Hello and welcome to Keep the Bastards Honest, the podcast of the Australian Democrats. I'm your host, Elana Mitchell, and on this episode, we look back on the absolute bin fire that was 2021. Welcome, beautiful listeners, to 2022. It's far too late for me to say, stand very still, don't touch anything, try not to breathe too hard. We don't want to break this year just yet, since we were not given an opportunity to admire the unrealised potential of 2022 before everything went horribly wrong. Again. So why put ourselves, and by extension you, through the ordeal of looking back at 2021? Well, because 2022 is an election year, and this is shaping up to be the most important federal election in years, if not decades. It's important to look back at what brought us to where we are now, and how that's going to shape the next 12 months. So join me, my co-host Steve Baty, and representing the Young Democrats and bringing the perspective of the youth to the podcast, Rhiannon Kernot, as we review 2021. Rhiannon, Steve and I pay our respects to the traditional owners of the lands upon which we met and their elders past and present. Sovereignty never ceded.
I have to say, the idea of trying to look back over 2021 and think about what actually happened last year rather than just leave it as the sort of dim, hellish blur that's now behind us all. I wasn't overly keen on that, I have to say. I mean, like when we talked about the idea for this session, I thought, yeah, let's do a recap of 2021. And then I started to think about, well, what actually happened last year. And I kind of fell out of favour with the idea the more I looked into it, what actually happened last year.
The conversation categorised it as the year of disappointment. And I thought that was a lovely way of phrasing that, last year, the year of disappointment, because that's how it kind of felt. It went by very, very quickly and not displeased it's over.
No. Got to say, like 2021 was sort of my annus horribilis for reasons that had nothing to do with the Democrats or the podcast. I mean, the Democrats, ironically, were one of the shining lights for me. They sort of kept me sane during that year when my personal life fell apart. So great podcast. Thanks for coming on, guys. It's awesome. We're just cancelling 2021 permanently now.
No. But I have to ask, so let's ask the question, Rhiannon, for you, what was the standout event in 2021? What was the thing that happened either as a one-off or through the year that stood out for you last year?
Starts with vac and ends with scene. Yeah, I think for me, consistently, the vaccine has been this buzzword. I know it's directly related to COVID. I know that's something we're dealing with the past 2 years, but I think to me, the vaccine has been the thing that continuously comes back and recategorizes and recharacterizes the politics that we're looking at. I think various different responses from these kind of key political figures are reinforcing where the power is, who actually has it, and as somebody who is consistently, I know where my vote goes, but looking as young people more generally, I think it's really outlined to me who I should and shouldn't trust, you know.
If I recap a little bit, so let's talk about the vaccine. For people who haven't necessarily been following it quite so closely, vaccines really started to be developed in the middle of 2020. They were first going into trials September, October. First ones were approved probably in the USA for emergency use, maybe October, if memory serves, maybe as late as November. And we started to see that vaccine rollout starting to happen in other countries. Australia took the approach of not using an emergency approval. The Therapeutic Goods Administration went through the normal process. It was going to take longer, but we were obviously in a position at the time where we didn't have any major outbreaks. The virus was reasonably under control. The economy was going reasonably well. It felt like we had a little bit of time and we waited. And really, we saw the vaccine rollout begin. I was going to say in earnest, but it didn't really begin in earnest. It began mid-February, late February, early March kind of thing. And when we talk about that sense of who got access to it, who was meant to get it first, what was the logic behind that early rollout, the idea was that we were going to protect the vulnerable first. And in theory, that's still like one of the drivers of the vaccine rollout will protect the vulnerable first. So we had that sort of 1A group, disabled, elderly, aged care residents, frontline workers. They were the people who were going to get the vaccine rollout. And I think pretty much that plan fell apart as soon as it started. And I don't think we really recovered until maybe September, October 2021.
Yeah.
And that was after mass outbreaks, basically. That was the only reason we recovered, because people got very, very scared very quickly. It wasn't really any push from government authorities or anything like that. It was because people were scared on their own and chose to go and get it.
Yeah. In a nutshell, what I found fascinating about the vaccine sort of rollout just basically falling apart the second it hit the ground was that it, I think, finally confirmed for a lot of political watchers that the government didn't know what it was doing. Like the Morrison skiving off to Hawaii during the bushfires of 2019 to 2020. He was still relatively new in the role of Prime Minister and all this sort of stuff. I think that could have been put down as poor political judgment. But him sort of cheesily and grinningly getting his vaccine, his first shot at the end of February to kick off the rollout, and then by April us realising that this was not going well, it kind of just solidified something around the Morrison government and the fact that they are shockingly incompetent.
I think, Rhiannon, to your point around who's being taken care of, who are we looking out for, that type of thing, there really wasn't a sense of urgency about that initial phase. Getting the vaccine out into rural and remote communities, getting the vaccine into aged care, both residents and staff, getting the vaccine into hospitals, frontline workers, into police, teachers, disability support workers, people living with disabilities, be they at home or in group homes. Like, those people should have been vaccinated fast, like with a sense of urgency. And instead we had that whole, it's not a race, like we're going to do this carefully, we're not going to rush it, like all of that kind of thing. And so you had people, especially when the Delta outbreak hit in the middle of the year, not being able to participate in society effectively because they just weren't protected. And there had been no real effort to protect them.
And I think at the start even, you couldn't get the vaccine. So I think that was the next issue that happened with the vaccines for a very long time, and really is still happening. I'm still seeing now, even with the booster shots, the accessibility of the booster shots is... It doesn't make sense when you say, oh, everybody has to do this, but you can't actually get it. And that was always the message the whole time, that you're saying this, but you're not actually seeing what's happening. So you're saying disability support workers have to get 2 vaccines, but they can't actually get them anywhere near them, or you're traveling, over an hour to try and access a vaccine just so that they can work. Out in my area, I ended up having to get AstraZeneca because there was no Pfizer available. I wasn't in a hotspot, as they were labeling them, and I actually couldn't get them. And my choice was, well, it's better to be vaccinated, full stop, because that was the message I was getting. And in 2 weeks' time, I'm not going to be able to go and see my friends or go out or do anything like that. I'm not going to be able to visit my nan. I'm not going to be able to go to work because I'm not double vaccinated. So the choice is removed from you anyway.
I think that period is when we realised that, and it was really shocking at that. I remember being gobsmacked at the time when the country realised that the government just hadn't ordered enough vaccines. Like, how do you not do that? Like, how... What the and to your point about AstraZeneca, I mean, we had that whole debacle of restricting AstraZeneca for those over 50 because, young people at risk of I'm not going to begin to try and pronounce it, but the thrombosis issue. And then purely out of necessity, you and thousands of your fellow youth were forced to go and get AstraZeneca anyway, for the reasons that you laid out, which was, well, I either participate in society or I get the AZ.
Yeah, your choice was completely taken away. And look, I'm still fortunate I was able to get vaccinated, because I think we're still looking at internationally, there are still numerous countries that can't even access one vaccine for those most vulnerable. Ultimately, I'm not your most vulnerable. I've now had COVID and I was okay. I was healthy and safe, whether that was for my vaccine, my age, whatever it is. But I'm ultimately not your most at risk. But for the people who it is at risk, where you don't have that choice, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And that the government's response this whole time has almost completely ignored that, has actually ignored that fact that we're not able to have access, we're not able to have the choice in this. And I think it's that has made it even more difficult to then try and get information or encourage other people to go and get vaccinated or just do the right thing, because there's so much misinformation. There are so many lies coming down from who you're meant to trust, who's meant to be in these positions of authority, that you don't know who to trust or don't want to trust anyone.
Well, this is it. I mean, the government is harbouring rampant anti-vaxxers in its own ranks because it needs their votes in order to maintain their hold on power, while at the same time trying to deport a high-profile celebrity anti-vaxxer. It, as you said, just doesn't make sense. Sorry, that's a 2022 problem. That's
I was going to say we're drifting into 2022. We're drifting into 2022. And I do want to come back to the anti-vax sentiment, though, because I think that was an interesting element or an interesting thread in 2021. But there was this whole thing throughout the vaccine rollout where we never really seemed to have enough vaccine to administer to a very well-known number of people. We know exactly how many people we have in the country, give or take. We know how many of them are of a certain age. We know where they are pretty much. The idea that we underestimated or we didn't order the right supply seems absurd given the seriousness of the situation. At least it continues to be a serious situation. It didn't seem to be taken seriously. And that's another theme, I think, for 2021 that we've seen, at a federal level at least, this sort of unwillingness to properly address issues in a timely fashion. And I think that's going to be a bit of a recurring theme as we talk about some of the other things that went on in 2021, Women's March for Justice, but that vaccine rollout, we're seeing the exact same thing play out right now with the 5 to 11-year-olds. We know exactly how many of those there are. We knew that the vaccine rollout would begin on January 10, and we don't have enough to vaccinate the children who fall in that age group. School starts in 2 weeks. We are in New South Wales, at least. New South Wales has managed to vaccinate 11.5% of that age group in the first week of that program. So with school going back in 2 more weeks, that's an awful lot of primary school kids who won't be vaccinated. And it's that same lack of urgency we just saw all through 2021.
I just think they're doing it really backwards, consistently it's get the vaccine and then we filter out a little bit of information around why you really should. Why should you actually have gotten the vaccine? Whereas what should have been happening is let's give that information first. Instead of having our terrifying ads on TV, why don't we make an ad about, somebody actually giving us step by step for 30 seconds the points of why vaccines are good, why vaccines work, instead of trying to scaremonger us like a smoking campaign. Because that's not going to work when this is targeted at every single person in the country. You actually need your kids also not to be scared about it in as much a non-propagandary way as possible. That's what we should have been doing first and foremost when those 1A and 1B groups were trying to get through. Let's get that information first instead of starting with you have to get this and then try and find it yourself.
The fact that Pfizer as a manufacturer came to Australia and said, how many do you want? We will give you any, here's a blank check of vaccines for your country, and the government didn't engage with them.
That's grossly negligent. In the midst of a global pandemic, that is grossly negligent. to not at least sit down and work through the details of that kind of offer. We needed and we need to vaccinate 20 million people twice. That's 40 million doses. Pfizer said they're yours if you want them. And we sent a junior bureaucrat to, blow them off.
And what blows my mind is that and I'm not even a matter of a leader being competent, because that's a really low bar, but a leader that gave a shit, that actually cared about their constituents and cared about us as a nation, would have said to Pfizer, brilliant, give me 150 million doses. I'll take care of us. I'll take care of New Zealand. I'll take care of all the Pacific Islands, because the unfolding disaster in Papua New Guinea is another humanitarian crisis that really went under the radar. And like, all of Oceania could have been taken care of if we had had a leader in Australia, and competence or otherwise. Because it's not just that Scott Morrison isn't, grossly incompetent, is that he simply refuses to lead on anything.
We're not talking about a lot of money either.
No.
Like 150 million doses, I think they were about $20 a dose. You're talking about $3 billion to take care of Oceania and, vaccinate all of the Pacific Islands and just deal with it, right? Like, let's just deal with it. And then this part of the world is taken care of.
Like, if we take care of that, and now we've actually created within Oceania a travel bubble of its own, and that we're actually the first region to have recovered from COVID or set up within ourselves a way to actually, instead of that, we're so, like, the state's on its own, that's a separate issue where we isolate ourselves, But imagine if we, instead of isolating ourselves or even our country, and actually set up those relationships so well that we now, redo the whole cruise industry, start getting the airline industry up and running, tourism's back up and running. If we had actually thought that, what's that $20 per person actually going to be worth in terms of the amount that they're going to spend within the region?
Oh, God, yeah.
Yeah, and to look at it from a brutal, pragmatic economic lens and not the warm, fuzzy, socialist, humanitarian lens that I just applied to it.
Stop caring about people, Elana.
I know, it's my fatal flaw.
Stick to dollars.
So, yeah, if we look at it purely through dollars, $3 or $4 billion investment in enough vaccine to cover all of Oceania would have had a return on investment in the hundreds of billions, because no one's economies would have tanked. As Rhiannon said, we could have had a travel bubble. All of the temporary migrant workers that this country exploits ruthlessly for our fruit picking and our agriculture and everything else, that could have continued on quite happily.
We wouldn't have that problem. And look, I don't actually think it's 150 million doses anyway. I doubt there are 75 million people in Oceania. Australia's got 25, and we're by far and away the largest by population in Oceania. Most of those island nations, we're talking a few 100,000 people. New Zealand is 5, 6, 7 million people, I think. So it wouldn't have cost that much anyway. But we're throwing away, and we still are, we're ploughing back into the ground billions of dollars in agricultural produce because we can't pick it. Again, for the third harvest of the pandemic, because we don't have access to the workers, we can't travel internally, we can't get those people from overseas. And as you say, that could all have been dealt with a little bit of forethought, a small investment, and it really is relatively a small investment.
They put aside $13 billion or something, or it might be even more for JobKeeper. That's JobKeeper alone. I think it was 13 billion or 130 billion. I can't
JobKeeper was a lot higher than that.
It was about 40 billion that we gave to the likes of Harvey Norman who didn't need it.
38 billion went to companies who ultimately didn't qualify.
Yeah. To put in perspective as to what could have saved our region, I want to read to you guys, this is a bit of a long snippet, but this is Tim Dunlop had an incredible piece on his Patreon around, he called it engineering neglect. And so I've taken it and I've sort of chopped it down to the bits that I thought were very, very relevant, but I obviously will share it in the show notes. But he says, From the very beginning of COVID, there has been a hugely influential and powerful faction within the political class, the politicians, business, and the media, who have opposed any and all attempts to constrain the pandemic or to respond to this massive public health problem with any measure that seems to them to favour general well-being over the ability of business to function unimpeded. From the very beginning, they have told us they don't really care about people getting sick or even dying, as long as nothing was done to impede the market. They have been yelling all this from the very beginning, and most people are still in denial that such a faction exists or could exist, or that they have aims other than the general well-being of the nation. Not only does this faction exist, not only is their agenda to let the pandemic rip so that a more entrenched market-based understanding of governance can be cemented into place, but that faction has won the day. We are living in their world now, as the daily infections, hospitalizations, ICU admissions, and deaths clearly show. The fact that their preferred form of chaos has actually been more damaging to their precious market than the lockdowns they abhor will not change their minds. Because having taken the country down this path, there is no going back. And that was the goal all along. We can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. And so from here on in, we will all be forced to cope with the consequences of the situation they have engineered. If they cared, if this was actually a case of straightforward incompetence, even the most incompetent government would have found a way to respond that at least tried to address the unfolding disaster. All we are getting is a double down. How much more obvious must they make it before we recognise what is going on? Until we start admitting that what is happening by design, that too many in the political class not only have no interest in our general well-being, but see advantage in letting things continue down this path, with token gestures of amelioration along the way, until we see what is staring us in the face, we will continue down this path of engineered neglect.
Yeah. The thing about that strikes me is that idea that now that we're in a position where, and Australia is currently in a situation where we have a major outbreak. Australia is one of the most infectious COVID hotspots in the world on a daily basis. Just in raw numbers, Australia is sort of 5th, 6th in the world in terms of daily case numbers. That's not by population, that's just raw numbers. Per capita, we're fighting for, like a first, second, or third with Spain and France at the moment, and there's not a lot in it in terms of new daily infections per capita. We are right up there, and we just weren't. We had it under control, and you've had this constant push to open up, to relax restrictions, for the sake of the economy, has been like a fairly constant push. But now that we're in the situation that we are, there's now this sort of rhetoric that says, well, we just need to push through it. I don't believe for one moment the politicians who are saying that, and it's coming in, I live in New South Wales, it's absolutely coming from the New South Wales state government, it's absolutely coming from the federal government. I don't think they really have a good idea of what pushing through means beyond a lot of people getting ill, a lot of people ending up in hospital, a lot of people dying, and the workings of our day-to-day social fabric falling apart.
Yeah, and we're going down the same path that America went down in 2020, and they're up to 900,000 dead.
I actually think we're in a worse place than America was in 2020 and 2021. But what we've seen around the world, every time there's been a major outbreak, is that the same things work. The same things work to turn around those outbreaks, whether it's the Delta outbreak in India early in 2021, whether it was the first and second waves in the US in 2020, whether it was the outbreak in Victoria last year. There is this sort of clear pattern that says these are the things that work. And our politicians have basically said, and we're not going to do any of those things.
No.
I think there's this real rhetoric around the expendability of people who are vulnerable and you're elderly, and that basically, unfortunately, those are going to be at risk. And it's this weird Darwinian survival of the fittest, which I didn't think we were still living in that sort of world anymore, where, if you manage to get through it, good for you, perfect. you're strongest, you survive, you get to move on to the next level. And instead, everybody else that doesn't make it through that has to just stay behind. And I think we're at this point where they go, we don't really care who actually gets through. We just know that some of you will and some of you won't. The one thing that, and I guess this is probably from a young person's perspective maybe as well, look, everybody's promised a lot of things. At 18 years old, I was promised that, you'll be able to go and travel the world. You'll be able to go to uni and have these amazing experiences and meet new friends, and you'll move out into be able to go and see different parts of Australia, which I can't still, which anyway, that aside, and that you'll get to have all of these wonderful things. And everybody told me, try and do those things while you're young, because you won't get the chance. I wish I did those things while I was young. And I think the one thing that's getting increasingly terrifying as a young person is, and this is where that message of we just have to move on does sink in a little bit for me, of how long do we keep going into lockdowns for? So I completely get the point of this is the thing that works, and I completely get it, but how long do we keep doing that for? Because I'm not sure where this thing ends anymore. Because when it all started, I think 2022 was the year we all kind of went, yeah, this is, once we all get vaccinated, we move on and that sort of thing. And now we're looking at 95% vaccination rates. And so how long does this keep going on for? And still nobody's able to give me an answer for that.
So Rhiannon, if we go back and we think about, if you sort of recall the national plan, the modelling that the Doherty Institute, for all its faults, one of the things that it was quite clear on is that high vaccination rates would still need some public health measures in order to keep case numbers down. Not lockdowns necessarily, not stay-at-home orders, not curfews necessarily, but public health measures like masks. Wear a mask indoor and on public transport. Maintain social distancing. Have capacity limits on things like retail, cafes, restaurants, pubs, like that kind of thing. There would still be those sorts of things in place. No, you wouldn't have to stay at home, and you would be able to socialise, but there would be some constraints in place, and those constraints might be tightened or loosened based on where we were in terms of case numbers and the overall prevalence of virus out in the community. What we saw instead was all of that thrown away in December. All of those measures were thrown out. People stopped wearing masks because they were told it's up to you. It's up to you whether you wear a mask or not. You take responsibility for your health, not recognising that you're also taking responsibility for other people's at the same time. I mean, these are public health measures. They're meant to be communal, not individual. But all of that went out the window. And here we are seeing the result. And I think that for me was one of the most disappointing aspects of 2021, was this ongoing push towards individualism in the face of a societal-wide, community-wide problem that we needed to address together. And instead we have this very, very strong rhetoric of individual choice, individual responsibility.
Yeah, I think the New South Wales December 15th was a very sad, disappointing day when we'd worked so hard for so long. We'd all done all that right stuff, we all kind of, and sorry, Elana, I know this is a little bit separate for you, but don't do this. But December 15th, and they got rid of any tracking. So I still don't know where I got COVID, but my estimated date is December 16th, because about 4 days after that, lost me sense of smell. So about then, so I have no idea. And it was probably at work while I was wearing a mask, sanitizing, social distancing still, because my work made sure that, mandated that still. All unvaccinated, anybody who was unvaccinated was able to go out in the public again, and masks were no longer mandatory. And then about 5 days after that, around the 20th, we saw a massive spike in the New South Wales case numbers, and it has continued to go up from there because, everybody went to Christmas, whether you were a little bit sick, try and not get tested. We didn't have enough tests available. They introduced this new thing called the rat testing that we'd all, was all so exciting because you felt like a scientist at home, but it wasn't actually. And December 15th for me was a real low in all of the measures that we had put in place and was the pinnacle of what we shouldn't be doing, basically. And it's exactly what you're saying, Steve, that we did need to still keep those things going. We should have still kept masks in place. We should have still kept, check-ins within reason, that, you check in at your hospitality venue so that we can keep up with it and that sort of thing. And that I don't think people would have had issues with that. You keep somewhat capacity limits. You try and keep masks if you're at, you go to the theatre or anything like that. And now what's happened is we've lost all of that because we couldn't keep those basic things in place. So I completely agree with you that, we always knew that the world was going to look different after this. I think it's, same as your 9/11, where it was going to change the way that we looked at the world and the way that, we traveled around the world. Security was always going to look different, and we had different fears and approaches to people around us. I think this was going to do the same thing, and we always knew that the world was going to look different after this. But people are still wanting to go back to 2019. People still want to go back there, and we're not going to go back there. I think, Steve, you're absolutely right in terms of, so we need to do those things so that we can have those freedoms, we can travel and everything like that. But whilst ever we don't have that approach, people still can't give a number of when do we get back to what the new world is meant to look like.
Sure.
When do we get forward to the new world?
Sorry, I have two things for that. One is, and we have to expand that whole thing of we need to vaccinate, test, trace, isolate, quarantine, socially distance to the whole world. And it gets back to the point we made before about how an actual leader in Australia could have looked after Oceania. All of the rich countries in the world should have done the same for the poorer countries who are still have the majority of their populations completely unvaccinated because they can't afford to buy vaccines, and the rich countries are hoarding them all. The second one, and it's entirely fitting for the first podcast of 2022, that I've got a quote from the inimitable Andrew P. Street on just this very issue. And he wrote, "Not only is the New South Wales economy the nation's largest and therefore essential to the whole we save the economy through our can-do capitalism narrative Morrison and Treasurer Josh Frydenberg have been unconvincingly pushing for the last few months, but Scotty also wanted to take credit for Sydney-siders being freed up to stop with all that annoying mask and QR code stuff and spend like the dickens ahead of Christmas. Once New South Wales opened up in defiance of the other states, the die was cast. Victoria and Queensland followed suit, albeit with many more restrictions. WA opted out and continued at hard border closure to provide a control for the experiment entitled, 'What happens if we don't encourage an epidemic we can't possibly handle?'"
Yep.
None of that happened successfully.
No.
Sydney-siders didn't spend up big at Christmas time. We haven't been going to restaurants and cafes the way we normally would. People haven't been holidaying the way that they normally would. Beachside towns up and down the New South Wales coast are barely ticking over versus the crowds that we normally see, like flooding those towns. None of that is happening. Experiment as far as, like boosting the economy goes has well and truly failed.
I think real irony in the 5% of New South Wales that was allowed out kind of from the 15th is now that 7% of New South Wales now has COVID, currently has COVID, 7% of New South Wales, not including all of your close contacts that would actually also be part of that. So I had 14 close contacts. So let's say every person only has 10. So you're looking at most of New South Wales is shut down anyway. So we don't need any restrictions because we all have to stay home anyway because you're in some form of isolation.
And the spending patterns are showing that. In New South Wales and Victoria at the moment, I think in the month of December, the ANZ reported recently that we're basically spending as though we're in a hard lockdown. That's sort of where we are. And that's going to mean, and is meaning, that people are losing jobs, businesses, small businesses are closing, large businesses are cutting back on the hours that people can work. Restaurants, cafes, etc., are operating at bare capacity. It's flowing right through the economy.
Rhiannon and I were discussing before the podcast. Rhiannon sort of made this comment about the perspective of me being in WA, and she said, "Oh, I guess it's a dilemma because you want to get back to normal." And I said to Rhiannon, "Well, the difficulty for WA is that we kind of have been completely normal for the last 2 years because of our hard border, because we essentially pursued a zero COVID strategy. WA has been living as if it's been 2019 for the whole pandemic. And if and when we open up in February, we're being asked to accept a level of disease and subsequently death that we've never been exposed to. The longest lockdown WA has had over the last 2 years has been for 1 week. And our economy has boomed. We've got a $5 billion surplus. Much as Andrew P. Street was joking about us being a control and an experiment, it is actually true because WA has demonstrated what an effective zero COVID strategy would have meant for the country and also the world. The whole world could have shut down for 2 months and just nobody moved, and we probably could have eradicated it.
And if you go back 12 months to the beginning of 2021, that is where a lot of us, most of the country was. That is the situation. At the beginning of 2021, Australia had racked up or recorded 28,000 cases in total. New South Wales recorded more than that today or yesterday. On January the 1st, 2022, just now, we had increased that to 430,000 cases, which is a massive increase. Yeah, it's a massive increase. But in the 2 weeks since, we've added 1.2 million cases.
Bloody hell.
That's 1/20th of the country. 5% of the country in the last fortnight have caught COVID.
Just to be the smug West Australian, do you know how many people caught COVID in WA yesterday?
1, 2.
They probably were probably in quarantine anyway as well.
They were isolating because they were close contacts. So we sort of separate ours out. So we have the community transmission ones, and we have the ones who have come in through travel. And I think we had we're still doing that. But I think we had 7 who've sort of who came basically off the plane into quarantine and were detected, and then 2 community transmission cases who were already isolating.
Can we move on from COVID?
Dear God, yes, please.
As much as it is, one of the defining events of 2021, and there's lots of it that we have talked about and could continue to talk about. I think the other big thing for me, or another big thing for me in 2021, was Grace Tame being named Australian of the Year. Her acceptance speech really set the tone around sexual violence, sexual assault, brought that topic out into the public domain in a way that is both necessary and has taken far too long. Brittany Higgins came forward with her story a few weeks later in February. So her story of sexual assault that occurred at Parliament House, I should say her story of an alleged sexual assault that occurred in Parliament House in a minister's office late one evening. The way that was handled or mishandled, again, was a big story in and of itself, but it formed part of a broader narrative around the Me Too movement that has been going on for a number of years, women coming forward, calling out sexual assault in the workplace, sexual harassment, sexual violence in various forms. And then we saw the Women's March for Justice on March the 4th, basically 12 months to the day from the release of the Respect at Work report by Kate Jenkins. That was a big deal.
It's massive.
Huge.
And it's funny because when I was looking back on 2021, I actually had this moment of total temporal sort of dislocation where I was kind of thinking, did the March for Justice actually happen in 2021 or did it happen in 2020? And I had to go look it up because it just didn't seem real that it happened in 2021, but it did. And look, I went to the one in Perth, which happened the day before. And I think the reason why it felt weird for me because it's like we weren't in year 2 of the pandemic then, surely, because again we were there, we weren't masking, it was completely normal. But it feels like the beautiful conjunction of Grace Tame being awarded Australian of the Year, and then in turn inspiring Brittany Higgins to speak up, and then in turn, everything that unfolded from that was just, it really felt like a reckoning that was long overdue. And it also leads into the Christian Porter saga and the allegation of historical rape that he vehemently denies, because I don't want us to be sued, and the tragedy of his alleged victim, Catherine Thornton. And I think with bookending this was the extraordinarily tone-deaf response from the government to all of this. I'll never forget Morrison's genuine and heartfelt confusion when he'd pull out the "as a father of daughters" trope, and then the female-dominated press gallery basically called bullshit on it and went, well, what happens to all the men who are not fathers and not husbands? How are they supposed to process this? And not to have a go at Morrison, but it was really telling how genuinely confused he was. Like he just couldn't compute it on any level. And that sort of seemed emblematic of the government as a whole on that issue.
Yeah, I think there's almost this new silence, which is not the silence that we wanted to hear. So I think women in these instances were silent for far, far too long, and we're still, unfortunately, there are so many women who are out there who still are not able to speak up. But the silence we didn't want to hear was from those leaders, didn't have a good response, who didn't have an answer, who didn't listen properly, who didn't start writing, legislation of how we could correct this, or what cultural changes can we actually have a look at, and genuinely listening. It was the wrong silence. We wanted to hear the silence of a listening ear, but instead we heard words that may as well have not have been spoken. For me, it's the start of something that's continued on for a while. It's the beginning of this new chapter. Hopefully in 2022 we are looking at a few more answers around that. I hope that it's not something that's going to be used for an election campaign, but I'm sure it is, that it's given open, empty promises, but something that is actually truly addressed with a change of government.
Absolutely be an empty promise. I can tell you that now. It will absolutely be used as a campaign thing. And I say that because legislation has been tabled for public consultation around addressing a variety of issues with respect to, violence in the workplace, harassment, etc. But it's been given a 2-week public consultation period in the middle of this major outbreak, in the middle of the school holidays, which feels... It doesn't just feel, it is completely inadequate and is pretty much on par with the rest of what we've seen in terms of a response to what is a serious and widespread issue.
And I want to also call out the women in the Morrison government who I think failed women of this country just as badly as the men of the Morrison government did. Because the whole issue didn't become a matter of women versus men or anything like that. It really did become it split along ideological pathways. And the likes of Anne Ruston and Linda Reynolds and Michaelia Cash choosing to prop up their government's woeful response to this rather than speak on it as women and as human beings was even more disappointing than the fact that Morrison was completely flummoxed by the whole notion that women were autonomous human beings.
The recommendations from the Jenkins report, I think memory serves, there were 49 recommendations in total. 6 have been adopted, only 6. And not for good reason. The remaining recommendations, actually, it might be 55 in total, and 49 aren't being implemented. A handful are, and only a handful are, and it really doesn't seem to have a good logic behind it. I mean, there are times, like when a Royal Commission or a Productivity Commission report, or Commissioner Jenkins in this case, where, some of the recommendations can't be done together necessarily, or they need to be done in stages. Fair enough. We'll do this bit, and then that lays a foundation for us to do this next bit later. That's not what's happened. Essentially, the government has said we're going to do this small part of it slowly. Let's also, like the Jenkins report was tabled in 2020, in March 2020. The government sat on it for 12 months. The Women's March for Justice, one of the things that was put on the table was, you need to do something about the Jenkins report. You need to actually that listen to the recommendations and implement them. It took a further 6 months for our national summit to take place, and then only 6 of the recommendations to be picked up. I mean, that's, I've seen people talk about the approach of this government as being go late, go half-assed type of approach to things. And this is a good example. I mean, it should feel insulting.
It is insulting. There's a clear pattern of a day late and a dollar short in everything this government does. And it's especially insulting because Jenkins very specifically said, don't cherry pick this. This report, these recommendations are designed to be put together as one piece, as you said, Steve. And the government promptly went and cherry picked the whole thing.
I could have understood if they actually, maybe there were 9 of them that they went, I don't know, maybe we'll think about these. We're not ready for these ones. But the 9 was only the ones that they considered. Like, it just once again epitomizes what this government is about. And it's not about any true attempt at change. They're not trying to make a difference, and I don't know why we would expect that. I don't know why I would expect that. Maybe you hope for more from your leaders.
Why not? This is a major issue. It shouldn't be the case that people show up for work, anybody shows up for work and isn't assured, like absolutely assured, that they will be safe. I get that should be a pretty fundamental part of the way in which our workplaces operate. It shouldn't be that we've got rules around spills and, whether or not you need a safety harness when you step up a ladder, but then people are being sexually assaulted and sexually harassed at work as a commonplace thing. The numbers of women who report sexual harassment and sexual assault in the workplace should be a source of incredible shame for every man in the country. Like, it really should be. We should be shamed in our bones that is the normal and common experience of women in the workplace throughout Australia. It really should be shameful for us.
And I think also for the country, to look at our national parliament as the single most unsafe workplace in the world, the single most unsafe workplace in the country for women. This is the place where the laws that protect women in other workplaces are legislated, and women in that building are not safe. And then look, the pandemic sort of overrode everything, but the fact that did not bring down the government, the fact that it just sort of just disappeared in the raging torrent of everything else that happened in 2021 is just, it's unbelievable.
COVID to disappear, because it actually allows them to kind of hide from anything else that's going on. Because you can we're dealing with something even bigger. Well, it's not even bigger because you're talking about 50% of your country's safety. You're talking about 50% of your country's safety, as opposed to what you've now said is only going to be a small percentage that's actually going to be affected by this. It's only your most vulnerable. Well, you're talking about 50% of your country right now is at risk. Or if they go into that place that is meant to be the epitome of what our country stands for, it is meant to be the place where we legislate safety, and you are not safe there. What's the point of anything else? What is the point of anything else? That should have been of the utmost priority, and once again we're left with a shitty answer.
Yeah. And it shouldn't take the Prime Minister's wife to remind him that it's actually an important issue for it to get any kind of airtime. I mean, that in itself is just ridiculous. For a grown man to sit there and say, actually, I had a chat with my wife overnight and she made it clear to me that actually this is something that I should care about.
This is something I was going to table to the side of something that's not really that important.
But the approach to the whole issue really sort of it summed up the government's thinking on it, which was, what bits out of the Jenkins report can we cherry pick to make the women happy, but doesn't actually mean that the men have to do anything different. The men's power, privilege, and ease in life won't be affected by doling out these little bits and pieces to make the women feel better about themselves. And
really,
that sums up that government.
I don't know all of them inside and out, but most of them, from my understanding, are the ones that basically gives you more time, like gives the woman more time to actually file a complaint about it. It makes sure that it's definitely prohibited. You're definitely not allowed to assault somebody in the workplace. I know it wasn't clear before, but you're definitely not allowed to do it now. Like, it's those things that, yeah, you're right. Your behavior doesn't actually have to change. It's the easy stuff that can say, oh, well, we ticked that off. Yeah, we're done with that. Thank you. Good writing, really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's... No. I could go on. There's another one. We could go on for hours about this because it's,
Yeah. Yes. All right. Let's draw a line under that part of the discussion and pick on another thread of go late, go weak, and talk about climate change.
Climate change exists last year?
Climate change did exist in 2021.
I just didn't think it existed because nobody mentioned it.
It flew under the radar. It flew under the radar a little bit, but yes. But we essentially wasted 2021 as an opportunity to really make an impact on climate change. If you think about our journey of this time we have, this decade leading up to 2030, where we've got 10 years that are critical to reducing our emissions, getting ourselves on a path to decarbonise the economy, really make some sort of deep structural changes to the way in which our economy operates. We had the pandemic as an opportunity to invest. The economy needed stimulus spending so we could spend more than we might otherwise. We could use debt as a way to spend extra money. And essentially, we wasted 2021 by not making any progress and actually going backwards in terms of approvals of new coal mines, approval of expansions to existing mines, the extension of coal-fired power. Yes, we increased our installed base of solar and wind energy, which was good. And mostly that occurred despite the federal government. But I think all around the country, with the possible exception of Tasmania, every state government had an each-way bet in terms of we'll shift to renewables, but we'll also continue to log native forest, open up coal, open up new gas type activities that mean really we didn't do anything significant in terms of addressing our carbon emissions.
No, the way the state governments, and particularly your government, New South Wales, has approached, because it's fascinating to me, because on the one hand, Matt Keane and the New South Wales government is held up as the gold standard of trying to approach climate change, because Matt Keane he's managed to corral the Nationals and actually get agreement to aim for net zero by 2050 and everything else in New South Wales. Yet at the same time is approving the expansion of coal mines in the Hunter Valley and the approval of new coal mines in the Hunter Valley. And they square that equation by saying, well, all the output from those coal mines is an export, and that coal will go overseas and get burnt in a different country, and therefore that doesn't contribute to our emissions. And it's like, but we have one atmosphere on this planet, and it just doesn't make any sense. But it's creative accounting at its most dire. And I think also, if we looked at the piece that I read from Tim Dunlop in terms of not caring if we live or die as long as this particular faction benefits, the same thing applies, but writ even larger for climate change. And we saw it unfold in 2021 with the gas-fired recovery and the idiocy of the Morrison government, getting gas executives to advise the government on how to re-stimulate the economy out of a pandemic.
We went through a period of denial, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, where people denied that there was a real problem. We are well and truly in the area of delay. Rather than taking aggressive, proactive steps and genuine steps, and by genuine, I mean put a moratorium on all new coal, all new gas, any expansions to existing things, cancel all petroleum exploration licenses, like anything to do with new fossil fuels, just stop it. Just stop it. Like that's the last one. Whatever we did last week, let that be the last one that we ever open, right? Like no more. That's step one for me that shows me that a government is serious. And until such time as either the federal government or the individual state governments step up and say, we've opened our last gas well, we've opened our last oil well, we've opened our last coal mine, we're not going to expand anymore, this is the peak, then they're not really taking it seriously. And the rest of it is a balancing act of delay. What can I say and do that looks positive, but really is just there to balance out the ongoing bad that I'm doing? The idea that, like I can dig up coal and export it overseas and let somebody else burn it and that's not my problem is disingenuous at best.
Mm. And it ties into what Dunlop was saying about this whole thing of delay is to get to the tipping point where we can't do anything about it. It's the let it rip strategy for climate. And once we're in that world, there's no turning back. And the career prospects of the generation that comes after Rhiannon is Mad Max style Roadrunner or Mad Max style apocalyptic desert warlord. Those are your two career choices.
Choose warlord. I think that is the And I think that increasingly I was going to say increasingly as we take increasingly less action, but as less and less action appears to be occurring, look, we were dealing with a pandemic. I'll give a little bit of leeway that that maybe everything wasn't going to go as ahead of schedule as it should have been, but it almost just felt like, and that's kind of what I said at the start, that, did climate change actually exist in 2021? Because it genuinely felt like it just wasn't something that was even on people's radars. It wasn't something talked about. It didn't make our media. I do think our media also needs to be held very accountable for a lot of this stuff, because I think it is, and increasingly, the media that we are receiving, it's actually terrifying me a little bit in how limited it actually is in what news we get, because it will just be one story over and over again, and that's the only choice that you really have. But so we won't hear about climate change, and then we kind of ignore it, and then we forget about it, and then we get around to this kind of point where we're reflecting back and go, hang on a second, what are we actually doing? And so now we're looking 10 years ahead, and we go, now we've wasted a year. 2020 was all the year of plans, so 2020 was our year of plans, and what are we going to do for the next 10 years? And now everything stopped because we've had this pandemic, and then we're going ahead and hang on a second, suddenly we're 8 years into the future and we ran out of time, but sorry, we were dealing with a pandemic. This is that we could only look at one thing at a time. We're not really, which more and more Scott Morrison I think would only be able to cope with the one thought at a time, but we've got no future direction. And so the Mad Max style world of the future is looking more and more present.
The frustrating thing for me, Rhiannon, is that we could have done both. So we could have addressed the economic side of the pandemic. If you think of like all of that big infrastructure spending that was in the budget, we added, I think, an extra $15 billion in infrastructure spending in this year's budget. We increased the overall pipeline from 100 to 110 or $115 billion in national infrastructure spending. That extra money could have gone towards renewable energy projects. It could have gone to a national rollout of big battery infrastructure in every state, located in areas where we invested in renewable energy and built a solar farm, built wind farms, tied it in with these sort of large utility scale batteries and begun that process. That's where you spend that $15 billion. Instead, we're propping up gas producers and promising to buy their gas in New South Wales and promising to build a gas-fired power plant in that's going backwards instead of the way in which we could have gone, yes, we need economic stimulus. Yes, some form of that economic stimulus can come in the form of, large-scale public infrastructure. All of that infrastructure could have been in renewable energy and the associated infrastructure that we need in the transmission lines, in the firming technologies that we need, the switching technologies that we need, the battery technologies or the battery infrastructure that we need. That was a good way to spend that money, stimulate the economy and help with the economic fallout of the pandemic. And instead, we wasted it. We wasted the opportunity.
Yeah, there's a running joke around cat owners that all orange cats have they have one collective brain cell and they have timeshares on who gets to have the brain cell at one given time. And I feel like that applies to our current federal government. And that's why you only ever see one minister at a time, because they've got the brain cell at that moment.
It would explain a lot.
Yeah, it does, but it ties into the fact that we don't seem to be able to deal with more than one thing at a time. So we can't roll out vaccines properly because we're busy dealing with the fallout from the government's Me Too moment. We can't address climate change because we're busy dealing with the pandemic. We can't order rapid antigen tests and deal with the super spreading disaster zone that New South Wales is turning into because we need to save the economy.
A timeshare on brain cells would explain an awful lot.
Yeah.
Whether it's just one or just, a small pool.
Very small. It's a small pool. Give them some credit. But on 1st of January last year was Advance Australia Fair had a small change to it from for we are young and free to for we are one and free. And I just wanted to hear what your thoughts were for probably the biggest cop-out of the year.
Oh, and that they set the bar really high, really early, January 1st, no less. My instinctive sort of gut reaction to that was, and apologies for the language, but it was kind of like, you've got to be fucking kidding me, because, and as you said, it was the single biggest cop-out of the year last year. We have the Uluru Statement of the Heart. We have all of these steps that our First Nations people, I shouldn't say our First Nations people because that denotes ownership and we don't, but our fellow First Nations citizens saying they've waited literally centuries for recognition, for inclusion in this country as equal citizens, and we deliver a one-word change to the colonial national anthem as, that's our contribution to Indigenous recognition and reconciliation for 2021. Well done, Scott.
Yeah, that's I think the only thing that happened on that list in terms of any move to better recognise our First Nations Australians. That's it. I just thought it was start off the year. It almost looked like it was going to be a positive thing that, we're starting off the year with something of change, and maybe that going into the rest of the year that we would have had some better acknowledgement. Maybe our Australia Day was going to finally change and look at appropriately recognising, Indigenous Australians, and once again it is just this symbolic thing that doesn't actually do anything.
No.
And it's empty symbolism.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was largely empty symbolism. I think the idea of a genuine attempt at reconciling our colonial past and the damage that was done and continues to be done to the people who were here long, long before us. We have a blueprint. First Nations Australians themselves have given us that blueprint. The Uluru Statement from the Heart lays out 3 things respectfully presented to white Australia and to the rest of Australia, non-Indigenous Australia. Here's what you want. Here's what we want to see from you. Here's how we can work together. Here's a journey that we can take together, and we respectfully invite you to join us on that journey. And we've ignored it. And instead, we changed one word in the national anthem. As you say, Elana, it's the colonial anthem. That's not the way to go about it. That's demeaning. It's not a genuine attempt. And we have seen a lot of that throughout last year, but also I think over the last 8 years, we've just not seen a genuine effort to engage. We've not seen genuine effort to reach out. We haven't seen a genuine attempt to listen at all. Still, it's one of my hopes for 2022. I absolutely hope we see a change in government, and with that change in government, I hope that one of the very first things that happens is that someone from the Labor Party stands up in Parliament and says, we move to adopt the Uluru Statement from the Heart.
I really hope so too, because I feel like that cop-out was bookended really brutally by the absolute failure to protect First Nations populations from the pandemic in the second year of the pandemic. Greater Sydney had its Delta outbreak in September because the government didn't lock down fast enough and comprehensively enough, and rerouted vaccines from rural New South Wales to Greater Sydney. And then that left the Indigenous dominant Wilcannia a sitting duck for the pandemic when it reached it. And more national shame for us. We insult them with this one-word change to our colonial national anthem, and also the smugness with which Morrison announced that. It's just like, go me, I have solved the First Nations crisis, and then it's bookended by the devastation of Wilcannia.
And the ongoing destruction of their cultural heritage. We mine their sacred sites. We ignore their entreaties to protect them. We say that we'll consider protecting those sites instead of developing them, and then we develop them anyway. We have processes in place that essentially make it easy to ignore those entreaties. None of that is genuine. Absolutely none of it is genuine. None of it feels like a good faith attempt to engage. It feels simply like a continuation of 224 years, 34 years of colonial misery.
Absolutely.
And I really do hope we see a change in direction this year. I really, really do.
Me too.
I think the unfortunate thing is, I think once again, even for the Australia Day theme for this year, respect, reflect, celebrate. Once again, it's kind of those empty words of here's what we're doing without any real change to back it. Maybe it's going to come around on Australia Day and there's going to be a fantastic big announcement that in acknowledgement of our proper reflection, we're changing the date, and we're also, we're actually going to accept the Uluru Statement of the Heart and actually have a First Nations voice. I highly doubt it though, but it's always nice to dream. Yeah, I don't know. It's just once again empty words, empty promises. A lot of emptiness in 2021 by the sounds of it.
Yeah, I was just thinking that apart from the individual disasters that unfolded in 2021, the sort of overarching theme that emerged in 2021 was the slow realisation that Australia is not a nice country. And it came up in so many different ways. Like we think of ourselves as, a bunch of larrikins, we're good people. At heart, we're nice people. We're not China, we're not Russia, we're not the Saudis. We're a nice country. That lie and that delusion was laid bare, I think, last year, not just in the way we treat First Nations people. It was in the way that we treated the Afghan people when our 20-year adventure in Afghanistan came to
an abrupt end.
Abrupt and humiliating end, and a tragic end for the Afghans. It's the way we treated Timor-Leste and the way that we're continuing to treat the people who blew the whistle on what we did to Timor-Leste, the way we treated our own citizens during a pandemic, the way we're continuing to treat our own citizens during a pandemic. There's something really, really ugly and just nasty in the Australian psyche at the moment, and it's that whole thing of a fish rots from the head. And we have had 8 years of a just truly repulsive government in place, and the country reflects that, I think.
One of the things that I would throw in to the discussion as some semblance of a positive is that clarity that you've just spoken about, the clearness with which Australia's institutionalised racism, our colonial history, our disregard for the vulnerable has been laid bare, hopefully affords us an opportunity for the beginning of some real healing.
Yes.
Because that's the Uluru Statement from the Heart says the first thing we need is truth-telling. And until we're actually going to be honest about our history, and until we're going to be honest about our present, we won't have a different future. I think the same applies to climate change. I think the same applies to our treatment of the elderly. I think the same applies to our treatment of women. Until we're actually willing to be honest about what's important to us and what we value, then improving those things and actually dealing with those issues and doing something to take positive steps is really impossible. So the fact that has become such a prominent front and center recognition, realization, hopefully that means that we're actually ready to start taking some steps to address it.
I really hope so, because I feel like that laying bare of the national character, like it's happened across so many different avenues, whereas in the past it would be one aspect of Australian society and we were free to then go, oh, but that's just that very isolated incident. But 2021 really, again, it was relations with First Nations. It was how we treated our elderly, how we treated our young people, our vulnerable people, the disabled community. It's how we treated, and this, I probably sound a bit smart-assy when I say this, but it's how we treated white middle-class people in this country. Because all of a sudden they got an inkling of what it was like to be a more vulnerable, lower socioeconomic, or dare I say it, non-white person in this country, and they suddenly discovered that they didn't like it very much. And it sort of fostered a certain amount of empathy for those who have suffered for years under our less, the darker angels of our nature, so to speak. And also, and again, not to be all warm and fuzzy and humanist and to get back to the brutal economic aspect of it, I think it was laid bare that, if not the death knell, then the stripping bare of neoliberalism and its limits and its destructive nature as well. And Steve, you talked about, we need to work out what we value. And if we value caring, it's not just that everybody benefits from, whether you're Jerry Harveys and Gina Reinhart's of the world down to the most vulnerable and the most marginalised. The economy benefits. The economy has stagnated for 8 years. Our wage growth has been non-existent for 8 years as the limits of neoliberalism has been reached. And if we were to embed caring into every aspect of society, we wouldn't just benefit in the warm, fuzzy, socialist, hippie sense of the word. We would benefit massively economically as well. And that's been a really interesting tipping point to get to that stage of going, it actually turns out that there's a massive economic benefit to dealing with climate change. Who knew? It's not a massive cost to society. We don't have to radically, we do have to radically change how we operate, but it's also, we get to radically change that for the better. Yes. And we will benefit from that.
Yes. I think the lesson there is that a lot more people will benefit from that way of operating than are currently benefiting from our 40-odd year neoliberal experiment.
And it's bizarre how people start backing, we need to invest in our people, we need to have payments and subsidies, and we have to have wage keepers and welfare and everything like that. And nobody calls themselves a dole bludger anymore or anything like that, even though that anybody that has ever relied on any sort of government support prior to 2020, 2021 did assume all of those labels, and suddenly in 2021 everybody went, oh no, we're all the same, we're all going through this, because suddenly it's actually hard for some people.
The lines of previously well-placed middle-class white people lining up at Centrelink when we went into lockdown, admittedly that was March 2020, that was not so much 2021, but that was a real turning point, I think, in the national psyche, where people weren't dole bludgers for seeking help. Like, we had a moral responsibility to people.
One of the things that I'm concerned that we're going to see, I'm concerned that we're going to see over the coming few months as we come out of the summer, which is typically a busy time for a lot of small businesses in particular, a lot of retailers, a lot of hospitality, pubs, cafes, restaurants, those coastal tourism businesses up and down the East Coast. Similarly, in and around Adelaide, the Adelaide Hills, wine country, the southeast of WA and on the West Australian coast, they're not getting that trade. And a lot of them rely on that trade to make it through the winter. And I'm concerned, and I've been talking sort of routinely with small business owners over the last 8 weeks or so as we've gone through this major COVID outbreak, looking at that trade over that traditionally busy summer period, and they're not seeing it. They're trading at 30%, 40% of their normal levels. And they're concerned about their ability to stay open, let alone retain staff. They're worried about their ability to keep their business running. So I still think that we're potentially going to see that type of occurrence coming, but that's that's something that's coming. Bringing it back to 2021 and maybe rounding out our discussion, which has been fabulous. If 2021 taught us something about ourselves as a nation that we probably should have already known, but has really been laid bare around what we value, and who gets looked after in our society and who gets looked after by our economy. I'm hopeful that 2022 provides us with that opportunity to do something about it, to change course, to reset what we do care about, to reset what we value, and to start thinking about an economy that works for people rather than the other way around. The economy isn't the point. It's there for a reason. It should be there to serve our well-being as a community and as a society. It clearly hasn't been doing that in the way that we really need it to. It's been working primarily for the few rather than the many. And I think if we can start to tackle that in 2022, we'll really be on a good path.
Yeah, I think the notion that the economy serves society needs to be screamed from the rooftops. And I think that the last 2 years has sort of demonstrated that to people, that we can literally shut down the economy because of a pandemic, and guess what? Society keeps going. So the neoliberal experiment of society being engineered to serve the economy was always a false premise. And I think that premise needs to be beaten to death and then buried and cremated. And our legislative and policy settings need to be reconfigured to allow the economy to serve society. And also, I think we haven't touched on foreign affairs, but I think also what we need to, our approach to foreign relations also needs to be re-engineered, and to be more caring, to look after Oceania and our Pacific island communities. Again, not ours, it's a colonial thing, but our neighbours, the people who share our region with us. And as a large and incredibly wealthy nation, we do have a moral and ethical and humanitarian responsibility to the people around us who are, I wouldn't say less fortunate, but less able to, who don't have the resources and the wealth available to them.
Yes.
Is what I was getting at. And it's reflected again, probably, look, one of my smart-arsey highlights of 2021 was the fallout with French President Emmanuel Macron and the "I don't think I know" response to the notion that Morrison lied to him about the submarines. I mean, yeah, there was not enough popcorn in the world for that one, even though it was a very, very serious and very damaging international incident. It was still, as a piece of theatre, was magnificent. The deliberate sort of pivoting back to an Anglo-centric view of the world, I think obviously has not gone unnoticed by the non-Anglo section of the world, but also it's so limiting and so self-serving. I mean, Keating was talking about this in the 80s and the early 90s about being, we are a country of Asia. The fact that we happen to have been invaded and colonized by white people from Europe, it's a blip in history. It is not a geographical reality. And Australia really needs to get its head out of the sand in terms of where we are geographically and the nations that we need to be talking to and not allying ourselves with, but trading and looking, mutually looking after each other.
Yeah, I think we're at this kind of really interesting point where we really can, hopefully in 2022, really change the attitudes that we came out 2021 with. We are this weird nation of our modern history, only past 200 years is as a Western nation. But geographically, we are an Eastern nation. And so I think we need to start stepping out of this, institutionalized Western narrative that this is who we are. We are such a new country. Let's approach it in that way. And I think just in what you were saying before, Elana, where we were kind of talking about those issues with WA even being this sovereign nation of WA and what kind of the future of Australia looks like, our stepping away from the not in my backyard idea, we do actually, without it being cheesy and cliche, we actually do need to start coming together, and we need to start coming together with our neighbours, and we need to start looking at what does the future of togetherness actually look like. And yeah, trying not to make that a cliche sort of story that we've all heard before, but in a genuine attempt of that we need to actually look at this differently, and we need to approach it differently, and we need to separate. Maybe Europe, we're not going to get to Europe in the next 3 years, we're not 5 years, whatever. We're not going to go back to our holidays over there all the time, or your trips to America or something. But what does it actually look like in traveling locally or traveling in our region? And let's start changing the story of what Australia is meant to look like and what Australia is meant to do.
I think one of the things that we're seeing and have seen play out over the last few years, and it's been quite stark due to the pandemic, is that we lack a coherent national vision of who we are and where we want to be headed as a country. And in the absence of that coherent vision, and it's not that we have competing visions, we actually just lack one. And so in the absence of that coherent vision, we're seeing individual decision makers at a state level in the different states and also at a national level making decisions that are based on short-term interests in a lot of cases. Sometimes, and I think you talk about West Australia, and Premier in WA, Mark McGowan, has shown a willingness to adopt a long-term view. And he's taken a position that, my job is to keep West Australians safe. It was a philosophy that saw Victoria do reasonably well with Dan Andrews taking a similar view. My job is to keep Victorians safe. The decision-making has fallen apart reasonably quickly, and you can see it in National Cabinet, you can see it in a range of other venues, that we don't have that. We don't have that vision of where we're headed, what we're trying to get to. We don't have it around climate change. We don't have it around respect for women. We don't have it around reconciliation with First Nations people. We don't have it around where we sit in respect to Asia and the rest of the world. And it really does show. And again, like if 2021 taught us anything, it's that's problematic. And in 2022, I really do hope that we start to see that articulation of a national vision that we can start to work collectively towards.
Yeah, I think 2021 has really taught us that in 2022, as an election year, as a federal election looms, we have a really stark choice between, well, hopefully someone who is interested in actually leading the country, who has a vision for the country, and hopefully we'll give him a chance to do that, versus the person who flatly refused to lead the country and who has no vision and has no concept of a legacy post his political career. The absolute nothingness of Scott Morrison has been laid bare quite brutally by events, dear boy, events. But I really hope that as a nation we decide that we need leadership. First of all, we need leadership, and second of all, we need leadership with a vision, because we've just lived through what it means to have a series of prime ministers who either have no vision, or, to give Turnbull a little bit of leeway, an inability to implement that vision because his own party opposed it. But yeah, we need a cohesive leadership across the country, because it's easy to blame the individual state premiers for the way they chose to approach the pandemic. But I think we need to put it in the context in that they were stepping up to fill the vacuum that had been left at the federal level by our federal government, and their either inability or refusal to lead us as a nation. To try and put a hopeful spin on all of this, much as 2022 has started really badly and is not the sort of the land of milk and honey that I think people were hoping it would be as we left 2021 behind us, here's hoping that we can course correct, and this time next year, when we reflect back on 2022, it's going to be a much happier and much more positive discussion.
Let's hope so.
Thanks, guys. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rhiannon. Thanks, Elana.
No worries. I think we can all agree that 2021 can be consigned to the dustbin of history, along with its predecessor, 2020. I do want to call out some of the shining lights of 2021, like the fact that Grace Tame was our Australian of the Year and single-handedly redefined the role. As I record this, Dylan Alcott has been named Australian of the Year for 2022, the first member of the disabled community to be awarded the honour, which is incredible, but also decades overdue. Congratulations to Dylan. He is an amazing advocate and sportsman, and I look forward to discussing his reign as Australian of the Year in our 2022 recap. As it is an election year and participating in elections is expensive, if you'd like to help us contest the next federal election, you'll achieve instant new favourite status if you donate to us. We're going to need $32,000 just to register our candidates to stand in the election, never mind things like call flutes, advertising, how to vote cards, or any of the other ephemera that elections require. If you set up a recurring monthly donation, email us at info@democrats.org.au to let me know, and I will thank you personally on the podcast and officially award you instant new favourite status. Can't go wrong. Keep the Bastards Honest is brought to you by the Australian Democrats. This episode was edited and produced by me, Elana Mitchell. If you'd like to keep in touch, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and LinkedIn by searching for Australian Democrats. And you can see what we stand for, what we value, and what our policy positions are at our website at democrats.org.au. Until next time, thanks for listening.